I'm delighted to invite Paul Merrey from KPMG as our host, and then we've got Hugo and Arthur from S&P. So Paul, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you, Matthew. I've never been introduced as a crash test dummy before. Many things. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. So we talked a lot about reputation, wildfires and schools. We're going to do a bit of a deep dive on one particular risk in this next session, political violence. Yeah? Anyone worried about political violence? Good, okay, you're in the right place then. So I'm joined by someone who actually knows a lot about this. So Hugo Foster is an associate director at S&P Global Market Intelligence, spends his life, I think, modeling the risks of political violence. So we're just going to try and get into the heart of how do you actually get into understanding the risks and helping risk managers and clients understand the risks and do something about it. So perhaps before we get into it, what is political violence for those in the room that aren't familiar with the term?
Thanks, Paul. I'll give you a quick definition. So we approach it as terrorism risks, civil unrest, so that would be protests and riots, and labour strikes as well, and war, so both civil and interstate war. But it's the political component that's really the key, the distinguishing factor here. I'd say unlike extreme weather events, for example, which I'm not an expert in, but these risks that we're talking about, they are instigated, carried out by human political actors, one way or another, who are, shaped or constrained, if you like, by political systems. So, and whilst these risks are complex, there are some hooks into them in terms of our analytical approach, and that's understanding those political and geopolitical dynamics.
Excellent. Okay, so in the last session, we were using spreadsheets to analyze all of this, but perhaps before we get into how to solve it, what sort of information would help clients understand the political violence risks that their companies face?
Yeah, so the second part of the term, the violence bit, and I would extend that to sort of disruption more broadly, so physical disruption emanating from these risks. This is physically occurring activity. It's happening, according to our records, hundreds of times every single day. From probably fairly low-level events through to some of the ones that you'll hear about on the news. So it's not true that there's no data. There is a data trail there. It's really about knowing how to really capture that data. So the team that I work on, and the area of my work, as you mentioned, it's really about kind of pinpointing the footprint of these risks. Like, how are they evolving, from one geography to the next? What form does this violence take? What types of assets or industries are impacted? What's the trajectory of it? And we're using open source intelligence. So broadly speaking, that means information that anyone can access. For us, it's primarily news-based media, sometimes social media too. But that's the information, and that's the raw material. What we're trying to get to is structured data, that can help us really understand the dimensions of these risks. And that's key because you want to take advantage of technology, particularly mapping tools, spatial analytics, which we'll come on to in a moment. But to do that, you need structured data, right? And you want information that you can aggregate and then leverage this technology. So, in terms of the risk managers that we work with, we really don't want to just throw tons and tons of news media at them, which they can get anyway. It's actually giving something more structured and really looking at the dimensions of these risks.
Okay, so what sort of analysis do you do then? You mentioned spatial analysis. What sort of activities do you do?
Yeah, so spatial. So this is the location component of the risk. As I said, they're physically occurring somewhere on the map, right? So that question of where, it's so important to understanding these risks. And our clients will include political violence underwriters. So they're specialists in this area. They're not trying to kind of put the brakes on business activity. They're trying to enable it. So what they're looking for is the information that will help you really differentiate these risks. And location is I would say the first, most fruitful line of inquiry that you can have. And one of the reasons why we put a map up here is just to sort of emphasize that when you look at the data on these risks, they're happening in some places and they're not happening in others. And it's not just about countries, right? It's subnational territories, cities, provinces of countries. We don't have time to go into any case studies, but it's very common for us to find that a disproportionate amount of the risk is in a small number of areas, and there's geographic factors that kind of underpin that. But some of our clients have found that actually you can sort of shift your risk management to being all at the kind of sovereign level, thinking about countries, getting down to a more granular kind of level in how you're organizing yourself, and that can be really sort of transformative.
There's enough risk in the world at the moment. Can you give an example maybe of a particular country where there's a particular zone to avoid, just in case we're traveling?
Well, I mean, I would say any large kind of geographically diverse country, I would just name off the top of my head Mozambique and the Philippines, two countries that I happen to have worked on in the last couple of weeks where there are insurgencies going on. Those insurgencies, so this is terrorism risk, they are extremely concentrated in terms of where they're occurring, and that's backed up by many, many, many years of data. So that geographic element is really there. It's particularly the case with kind of larger, sort of geographically diverse countries, but those also happen to be the ones that our clients are often most interested in.
So I'm thinking of going to the Philippines on holiday, so I can tap you up as to where not to go. This looks more like Colombia, but who is using the data then? You just mentioned underwriters. What are they using it for, and what are others who are using the data?
Yeah, so insurance underwriters, but also exposure management within insurers, corporate security managers, risk managers more broadly, and increasingly within our business, it's supply chain risk managers. I think, if you try to look behind what these different personas are trying to do with the data, they're often coming from a locational point of view. I've got an asset or an asset class, an occupancy, in insurance terms, or actually just if you're talking about exposure management, it's hundreds of thousands of assets that I'm interested in, but it's location nonetheless. And I guess the common denominator is pretty complex footprint in terms of locations, multinational kind of cross-border locations, lots of risk going on in different parts of the world, and it's a struggle to keep on top of that. So again, the location component comes into this because it can help you understand the patterns that are there. But actually, if you're a data-enabled organization, if you know where your stuff is or where your supplier locations are, you bring that into the analysis. And in a nutshell, what spatial analysis is intersecting different layers. So here's the risk, here's the exposure. Let's look for the insights that we can get from that.
Well, that's excellent. I now notice it's actually Chile, isn't it? Valparaiso. I've been there. Beautiful coloured houses all over the place. I hadn't realised there'd be so many coloured dots on the map as well. In terms of let's talk about the technology. Linking back to the last section, we were hearing that everyone's using spreadsheets. So presumably you've just got some monster Excel file running all of this data.
Absolutely not. I mean, people. That would have been the case, when we first started sort of collecting data. Like, let's start with a spreadsheet and let's see how far we can get. But we need all of our data, in one place, and that's because we're going to use it. We're going to use it in models like some of the ones that we've put on the screen there. We're going to use this in, I don't want to say real time, but reasonably live, dynamic, modeling processes that are pulling this data in on a fairly regular basis, every single day or multiple times a day, and we're looking for change in these patterns so that we can alert our clients to those changes. So we need to make sure that it's not in spreadsheets, it's in a database, flowing through to our own platforms where customers may be accessing this data, but also through APIs as well.
And I understand you do more than just provide the data to clients. So what else does S&P Global Market Intelligence do? Yeah,
so I mean, probably a lot of people understand the business at large as being a data business, but for us in our political risk or political violence risk sort of unit, it's really about forecasting, I would say. So helping clients look down the line and understand what can they anticipate in the future. which is not an easy thing to do, and we don't get things right all the time, but data is a building block of that. I would say this probably reflects a little bit of my work, but I do think that looking at past trends and looking at the frequency and with which certain events happen over a period of time, that can get you a long way to the answer. But, particularly if you're looking at some of the geopolitical risks that are around in the world, and particularly the wars, which is something that we're spending a lot of time working on, just looking at the past data is only going to get you so far, and you also want to be looking at the those political and those geopolitical dynamics. So that's where our analysts would come into this.
All right, so you've got a human element over the top of it, which we haven't replaced with AI yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So more or less, our country risk team is, I think, sort of 40, maybe 50 analysts. So they'll primarily be focused on, a country or a set of countries that they have, expertise in the, in the politics of that particular country. And then there's economists as well. So their perspective is going to be more about, the wider kind of macro picture about these countries. They can think about dynamics. It might be to do with the economy, to do with that political system. And when you see something happening on a map, or you see a development that is coming from the data, they can interpret that and say, well, actually, this is significant for this particular industry, or and not these other ones, or it's likely to evolve in this particular way. So they can help tease out the so what factor, but also look down the line to these future risks that you're not going to have data on because they haven't happened yet, essentially, and start to think about in particular kind of high impact but perhaps low probability scenarios, but that our clients would be really, really concerned with nonetheless, and start to develop, I guess, kind of indicators that you would look for to see are these things becoming more or less likely. And then that can kind of feed back into our data collection work as well. So, we then know, okay, well, we should be really concentrating in these areas in terms of the types of things that we're looking for.
All right, thanks, Hugo. We're going to open up for questions in a second. I'll just ask you one more while people put their thinking caps on. I guess there's so much going on in the world at the moment and so many events. Are there particular areas that your analysts are facing more questions about at the moment?
Well, I mentioned, war risk, obviously, with the situation with Ukraine and in the Middle East as well. I think quite often in that instance, what happens with these conflicts is that they can settle into certain patterns that that we can observe through maps and in the data, and probably after a period of time, a lot of our clients will have sort of mitigated their risks, but then they're going to be asking questions around what's coming next. So it's those escalation pathways that we would look at. And then also civil unrest, which is why we put this Chile example, because the 2019 sort of major riots across that country, I still get asked about, particularly from some of our insurance clients, for data on this, because they're trying to understand, the dynamics of these scenarios. So major riots are a particular concern because they're not happening in far away, remote so the conflict zones. They're happening on the doorstep, so to speak.
It looks like one street, basically.
Yeah, so they can be very specific in that way.
That's good. Okay, let's open it up to questions then, in the front row or near the front row.
Hi there, my name's Abdul. I work for Travel as a pricing actuary. I've got a question about the PV wordings of the radius. So the radius of when something happens. So when we're getting reinsurance, sometimes the reinsurers have a different definition of what the radius should be versus ours. And if a claim actually did happen, that would be quite problematic for us. Have you factored that in some of these circles you got here? So you got some, it's not a circle, it's a pentagon or whatever it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, hexagon. Yeah. So what is the radius of it? What kind of stuff do you have? Can you change that? So if we're looking at that data set for a smaller radius versus a higher radius, the impact of those, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So these hexagons are, I think they're 3 kilometers. So each edge is about 3 kilometers, which I think is, it all depends on what you're trying to do. If you have a more sort of strategic question, it's kind of where in this country, is the risk sort of concentrated? I think that's is a pretty reasonable sort of resolution. One of the things that we're obviously we collect data, and this data has different levels of precision. So we may adjust that kind of radius based on the precision of the data. But I think you can maybe see it's kind of right behind me, but there's an inset map showing risks in a particular city, and actually if you want to, you can be very, very granular with this data as well. So it really depends. You should choose the resolution of a map based on the type of question or the type of decision that someone's trying to make. Is it very tactical? We've got corporate security managers who are really very tactical in what they're trying to do. And perhaps on the insurance side is a bit more sort of strategic.
Just second question quickly.
Ooh, cheeky.
So you said you get your main data source from news feeds. Do you monitor how political left or right they are and where they come from and so on? And how do you factor that in those points as well?
Yeah, so that's probably, as well as the mapping side, that is the thing that my team spend probably the most time on is just working out what sources do we want to use and how do we use them. There's a lot of opinion and commentary that comes in news. It's subjective, it's messy, it's unstructured, and that's problematic in many ways. But the key is being able to sort of understand these limitations of sources, so in what context you can use that information, and kind of narrowing in on the stuff that you want and essentially binning the rest of it. But we will try to quantify the let's say the credibility of sources as part of that process.
Thanks.
Right, excellent. Thanks a lot, Hugo. I think we're going to wrap it up there because we've got a rapid agenda that we've got to move on with. But hopefully that's given you a great example of some of the good things that are happening and can inform management of risk that moves us a bit beyond spreadsheets, as I think you can see. So perhaps a round of applause for Hugo. Thank you. Thank you.